Blitzkrieg is the 10th full-length album from Blitzkrieg, a Sunderland, England-based heavy metal band, and one that's been around since about 1980. This is their 10th album, as I said, but they started out as something very different. It was much more of a late 70s heavy rock band with a different vocalist, and by the time they brought Brian Ross in for their actual first lineup, they had a very different sound. It was more influenced by the upcoming heavy metal sound at the time. They definitely had their own sound. There was a lot of conviction in their early songs, and as their performances tightened up and they really knew what they were doing after a couple of years, they worked on Time of Changes, and that album was a way for the band to come back. It wasn't necessarily as famous as their early singles, but it was a big album for 1985. If you look at the new wave of British heavy metal played out, 1985 was actually very late in the lifespan of that wave. Some would even consider it a little bit more late in the process, where speed metal and thrash metal were already taking over the British heavy metal scene at the time, and really people knew this band because Metallica covered them later on. And so what happened to the band between 1985 and 1995? Well, if you listen to Unholy Trinity, it didn't sound like anything much had happened. It was a very similar direct follow-up. It was a longer album. It was a little bit indulgent, but it still sounded like 80s metal. It sounded quite dated for its time, and I love it. It's a very good album, and I think if you don't know the history of this band and you've always avoided anything they've done after a time of changes, go listen to Unholy Trinity. If you're a fan of the neat record style and the sound of this band and the way that Satan sounds now, you'll find Brian Ross had developed a melodic style that was already very evident at that time, which you'll also find from 2011 beyond in his other band. Anyway, we're here to talk about this new album, and I go into quite some detail in the history of the band in this article because I feel like it's really important to know everything the band has done and why this latest album is impressive. Now, a lot of people would be happy to sweep everything beyond 2005 under the rug, but there are some good records in there, and I think that if you give them some due time, there's quite a lot of good musicians who played in Blitzkrieg. I don't think they've ever been very commercially successful, but if you don't understand the appeal of a record like Theater of the Damned back in 2007, you're missing out on the personality of the band as it continued to develop with different musicians. So for me, that's a cool record. I thought I'd at least mention that, but is a lot else to read about here, and I think this band is generally worth your time if you're a fan of classic heavy metal. Like I said, if you like this record and it surprised you, there's a lot more Blitzkrieg records out there that are going to be worth your time. They might sound a little bit raw and rough for like the 2000s or the 90s. Now, for this new record, let's cut into a song and see what's a little bit different about this one. Why does it stand out, and why are people being pretty positive about it now? Satan having made quite a comeback and put out several albums that have been of very high quality. You might be thinking, well, why hasn't Blitzkrieg ever been able to sort of make it back into the public eye and really take over? And it boils down to production values and songwriting. I think that because there isn't a team of guitarists that have been consistent for the band for so many years, that the quality of the records are hit or miss depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a new wave of British heavy metal sound, you won't really get it after the 90s. And if you're looking for something more modern or speed metal oriented, they've never quite moved past the sort of 80s sound, other than incorporating things like double bass and more shredding and whatnot. The real note to take here is that there is a new lead guitarist in the band, and he is also producing and recording the group. And that means that the quality and the dynamic of the recording is up to a modern digital standard, and it sounds quite good overall. Also, the fellow can shred, so there's a lot of shredding, melodic guitar work on this record, and that takes it into a newer generation of sound and a newer generation or a newer fidelity overall. The playing is better. It's not so much a classic heavy metal record album as it is a little bit of a power metal touched thing with the distinct voice of Brian Ross up front and the way that he develops vocal melodies, which is inspired as ever. You can expect performances with a lot of personality on this record, from the singles like The Spider to the kind of Dio-esque Dragon's Eye, and the strange conspiracy theory commentary of If I Told You. There's a lot here that's just kind of goofy, but also entertaining in a good way. And I think it's a strong heavy metal in that sense. If you remember what the 80s were like, or you understand how metal can be kind of fun, but also approach serious themes in a different way. So yeah, there's songs about conspiracy theories, and one that's narrating what I guess would be Halloween 2 or 3. I guess The Night He Came Home. For me, that's Halloween 3, but that's a different subject for another time. I think the thing here is that this is a sharper record from the band. It is one of their better melodic offerings. It has very strong performances throughout. And I think if you're just a fan of Brian Ross's vocals in Satan and you'd like to check out his other band, this is in some ways very similar to the what he's built for himself and his own personal style since the mid 90s or so. So I would recommend checking this out if you liked Satan's last several records, of which I think there was one that came out just a week after this record, so check that one out too. Overall, a great showing from Blitzkrieg. I don't know that it is the most memorable record out in September. I don't know that it's going to stick with me for all that long, but I do know that every time I see that cover and think of this album, I'll think, hey, that's one of the better records from this band. And I think after 10 albums, it's more or less a big deal that I can come back and still be entertained by not only Brian Ross's vocals. He's put together a good crew for this album, and I think that he's done a great job of curating this record, putting it in the right hands, and making sure it sounds like Blitzkrieg. I think if you like Blitzkrieg and you know what that means beyond 1985, you will appreciate what this record is all about and how they've kind of tightened up their whole process. Again, which I think is one of their best albums to date. So check it out yourself. It released on September 6th. And go ahead and preview some of the songs on the website and read my review.